Divisions existed in England during and immediately post-Civil War. Now, these groups which emerged seem quite normal in comparison to the politics that we have today, but in a society that focused itself on the great chain of being, which is the social hierarchy of society at the time, these ideas that were promoted by these groups were deemed to be extremely radical in their thinking, which is why they were deemed to be threatening. So the key three groups that existed during and post-Civil War were the Levellers being the most kind of popular and deemed to be threatening group at the time, followed by the Diggers and lastly the Millenarians. So the Levellers were predominantly based in London. We could argue that this made them quite threatening in terms of radical ideas because they were in the central point of where politics was based. And they sought political, economic and social reform in response to the civil wars. So they used a lot of media to gain attention. You could argue that the Levellers were a pre-early modern pressure group, like we do have now. And they used media to gain attention. For example, the large petition of 1647 and pamphlets, they also had their own newspaper called The Moderate, and that simplifies their overall aim, which is to be a moderate political outlet for the lower class people. They're quite socialist in their way of thinking, that they promote the lower working class ideas, and they particularly try to drive themselves into the New Model Army by speaking to and promoting the interests of the average soldier as opposed to the elite commanders. And this is then later dealt with quite harshly by Oliver Cromwell. So the Levellers media campaign demonstrated how politics had moved beyond the political nation being the group of gentry and nobility that acts as a go-between for the monarchy and the normal working class people. And the Levellers criticised leading army officers, particularly Cromwell and Ireton, who and they published the pamphlet, The Case of the Army Truly Stated. They criticised Cromwell and Ireton because they felt that whilst they were creating their proposal agreement with Charles before he escaped his arrest and his house arrest, that they were discarding the interests of the normal soldier and only promoting their self-interests as a gentry and noble. So the Levellers launched their manifesto, Agreement of the People, and this demonstrated how they were very much a socialist political movement, promoting the interests of working class people. And the fact that they launched a manifesto in itself is something that only a political party would have done at this time. So they're very forward-thinking, very moderate, very socialist and very democratic, which at a time whereby power is solely based on your wealth and status within society was deemed to be radicalised and threatening to the status quo. So during the Putney debates, which was post-Civil War, they argued that MPs should be proportionally elected within their constitutions, so their communities, i.e. the size of the area should warrant the amount of MPs that should be in existence representing the people in those areas. So if you've got quite a small community, you should only have one MP representing you. But for areas such as London, where you have a higher density of population and a higher geographical area to cover, there should be more people elected from those areas that represent all kind of class backgrounds. So very much a normalised political proposal by modern day standards, but as said, for this time period is very radical. And they also believe that all men should have the vote, not just those who were earning more than a few pounds a year. So Cromwell was able to force the end of the movement by paying his troops, which kind of quelled their disgruntlement, and refocusing their energy into dealing with Charles, who had escaped from house arrest and renewed an agreement with the Scots. So the Levellers kind of lost a little bit of support during the phase of the Second Civil War. But the Levellers attempted to reunite after the house arrest of the king during the Whitehall debates, as they wanted to create a constitutional framework for when the king was dead, starting with the criticism of the Rump Parliament. So Rump Parliament was where the royalist moderate sympathisers were removed from Parliament, so the only politicians which remained were those who were Pym, Cromwell and Ireton supporters, and the Levellers argued that wasn't constitutional, it wasn't democratic. We should have an array of different politicians that represent all backgrounds. And in response to that, the Levellers, including Lilburne, were arrested by Cromwell for being too radicalised and for instigating corruption within the New Model Army, and that contributed towards its demise. So it's a bit like how the Nazis kind of lost their following during the 1920s because of Hitler's arrest. Leveller was a charismatic leader within the Levellers, and his arrest and imprisonment for a period of time meant the Levellers just lost their momentum and they fizzled out as a movement. In contrast, we have the Diggers. They're quite an anarchist movement. They are kind of the equivalent to communism in this time, whereby they don't believe in a political structure, that basically everyone should have a say in politics and how they're governed, and there should be an equal distribution of wealth, which for a society which bases itself on its hierarchy for and based on wealth, the Diggers were deemed to be almost more threatening than the Levellers themselves. And this is created by a guy called Winstanley, and in response to the effects of the civil wars. The Diggers believed in total social and political equality completely, that we shouldn't be having a class society. And they often call themselves the true Levellers because they've gone one step further than the Levellers, who are quite socialist, to the Diggers, who are quite communist. However, the Diggers had a relatively small following, unlike the Levellers, which were much larger in their support. But they adopted direct actions, so they would quite outwardly protest on land and in the political domain, and they promoted communist ideals. The movement was defeated by Fairfax, though, Fairfax took a little while to react to the Diggers. I don't think he was that threatened by them. However, there was a lot of pressure placed on Fairfax by elitist communities, so landowners, who were concerned that the Diggers would become more popular amongst their workers if they continued to encourage this idea of a classless society. So they were defeated by Fairfax, and the Levellers were defeated by Cromwell. Millenarianism wasn't really deemed that much of a threat, purely because it was supported by members of the New Model Army from all ranks. They called themselves the Fifth Monarchists and expanded on earlier forms of millenarianism, which was seen earlier in this pack. And the leading individual for the Fifth Monarchists was Colonel Thomas Harrison. So note how his title is Colonel. He is from a militant background himself. This may also contribute towards one of the reasons why the New Model Army were supporters of millenarianism. And they believed in Parliament being governed by a saviour, so someone that would restore democracy, someone that would restore political greatness. They weren't particularly keen supporters of Charles, and they believed that their saviour for Parliament was Oliver Cromwell himself, which is probably another reason why the New Model Army generally supported millenarianism. But in all, when we're looking at these three movements, we have to consider that these groups would not have been accepted under the personal rule of Charles I. He would have eradicated these movements very quickly based on his paranoia as an individual, of any criticism that he received being seen as revolutionary. But also the fact that we're now moving in towards an era within Stuart Britain whereby democratic ideas are being partially encouraged within reason, unlike under the monarchy reign at this time. The Fifth Monarchists kind of replicate the political voice that the New Model Army now had. And whilst quite a few of them had short-term failures in the fact that the Diggers and the Levellers were kind of destroyed by Cromwell and Fairfax, the long-term significance of these movements is that it does radicalise the lower classes, it does start to encourage political voice, and it does start to move away from that old-fashioned style of monarchy greatness and power over Parliament, and that actually Parliament is becoming much more varied in its representation, and that has only been allowed to happen as a result of the Civil War and the dismantling of the monarchy under Charles I.